The snow came early that year. Thick flakes drifted from a gray sky, piling on the pine boughs like ash from a fire that hadn't stopped burning. The wind screamed down from Eagle's Beak, slicing through the valley and coiling itself around the cabin perched just above the tree line. Inside, Jonah Pike stirred the fire with the tip of a wrought iron poker, eyes narrowed against the heat, listening to the world outside with a soldier's ear. He'd seen storms like this before, cold that broke men's bones, wind that could steal the breath right out of your lungs. But this time the storm brought more than snow. He heard it first, a soft scrape, not a branch, not wind, a sound out of place. Jonah moved toward the door like a bear awakened midwinter. At 6'7" he filled the cabin without trying, a broad shadow against rough-hewn timber. His brown hat hung on a peg by the door, wet from yesterday's hunt. He didn't bother with it now, just reached for the heavy oak handle and unlatched the bar. The door creaked open, snow whirling in around his boots. And there, crumpled on the porch like a dropped rag doll, was a child, tiny, barely 5, maybe 6 years old. Her shawl clung to her shoulders like a cobweb, and her blue cotton dress, torn and too thin for the weather, was already rimed with frost. One hand clutched a small wooden doll, the other was curled around her knees. She lifted her face. Big eyes, the color of creek water after a storm, stared up at him. "Are you the giant?" she whispered. Jonah didn't answer. Couldn't. He hadn't heard another voice in days, weeks, and certainly not one like that, soft and curious, without fear. She didn't scream at his scar or scramble away from his massive frame. She just waited, shivering. "Inside," he said, voice rough as gravel. She didn't move. Jonah stepped forward, boots crunching the snow, and crouched low. He looked down at her, this waif in a snowstorm, with flushed cheeks and breath barely visible. She looked half dead already. So he did the only thing that made sense in a world that rarely did. He reached out and gathered her into his arms. She weighed less than a sack of oats. Her body curled into his chest like she'd done it before. The cabin door slammed shut behind them, muting the storm. Jonah strode to the fire and lowered her onto the bearskin rug. She blinked slowly, like a rabbit too cold to run. He grabbed a wool blanket from the bed and wrapped it around her, then stoked the fire until it roared. Only then did he kneel beside her again. "What's your name?" he asked, low. "Elsie," she whispered. "How old are you?" 5. "Where's your family?" She hesitated. The flames danced in her eyes. "They don't want me." Jonah leaned back on his heels. The wind howled beyond the walls, but inside the cabin, a different kind of silence took hold. The kind that doesn't just fill a room, it fills years, decades. He'd seen this before, in war, in the eyes of boys too young to carry rifles and too old to cry. Abandonment had a shape to it, and this child, Elsie, wore it like a second skin. He didn't ask more. He stood, crossed to the small shelf near the stove, and poured hot water into a tin cup. From a crock beside it, he added a spoonful of honey. "Drink this," he said, kneeling again and holding the cup to her lips. She sipped, then drank faster. When she finished, he gave her jerky, then tore a piece of flatbread from the pan he'd left on the stove. Only when she had eaten did her shoulders stop shaking. Jonah sat back in the rocking chair, arms crossed. The fire warmed his boots, his hands, but not the place inside him that had gone cold years ago. She was asleep within minutes, wrapped in his spare blanket, curled beside the hearth like a hibernating cub, her wooden doll resting in the crook of her arm. Jonah watched her. He couldn't look away. 15 years alone on this mountain had taught him how to read signs, paw prints, broken branches, shifts in the wind. And everything about this child's arrival screamed that his life was about to change. He hadn't invited it, but it had come anyway, Pine Ridge, Colorado, was the kind of town where news spread faster than fire on prairie grass. Nestled between the lower Rockies and God's last breath, it boasted no more than 300 souls, a single church, and an unspoken agreement not to ask too many questions, especially about the man who lived 2 miles above them. Jonah Pike was part legend, part shadow. No one had spoken to him in years, not beyond the barest transaction. Children were told to stay away from the trail to Eagle's Beak. They were warned that the man up there had killed a mountain lion with his bare hands, that his face bore scars from a rebel's blade, and that he hadn't been right since the war. All true, but none of it was the full truth. Jonah had once been the town's own, son of Jacob Pike, horse trainer, husband to Sarah Mitchell, father to a child who never saw her first breath. He'd left Pine Ridge in 1861 with a straight back and a hopeful heart, and come home in 1863 with blood on his hands and 2 graves waiting beside Willow Creek. No one knew what to say to him after that, so they stopped trying, and Jonah, in turn, climbed the mountain and stayed there, until tonight. The next morning broke pale and cold. Sunlight spilled over the snow like honey on cream. Jonah opened the cabin door to a world reborn in silence. Inside, Elsie stirred. She sat up slowly, blinking at the unfamiliar room, then looked toward him. "You're really tall," she said. Jonah huffed a sound that might have been a laugh. "You're really small." She smiled. It was the first smile he'd seen in a long time that didn't make him uncomfortable. "I came looking for you," she said. "They said you were a giant who ate wolves and scared away bad people." "And you still came?" She shrugged. "Better than going to Denver." His brow creased. "Denver? My uncle said that's where I'm going. Some home for kids nobody wants." Her voice was matter-of-fact, too matter-of-fact. "Do you want to go?" "No." "Why come here?" "Because I heard you don't talk to people." She paused. "But I thought maybe you'd talk to me." Jonah didn't reply. Outside, a raven croaked from the pine. Far below, in Pine Ridge, someone would be waking up to an empty bed and a trail of footprints in the snow. They'd be coming. He could send her back. He should. But something about the way she looked at him without fear, without pity, made it hard to imagine letting her go. And when she added, barely above a whisper, "I don't have anyone else," Jonah Pike realized something that struck him like a Confederate bullet to the chest. Neither did he. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the sound of hooves, distant, faint, but coming closer. Jonah rose to his full height, pulled his coat from the hook, and reached for the rifle leaning by the door, not out of threat, but out of instinct. He was no fool. He knew the world didn't understand men like him, and it never would understand why a man like him would open his door to a girl like her. He turned to Elsie. "You stay by the fire." "No matter what." She nodded once. Jonah stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him, squinting into the morning light, waiting to face the town that had forgotten him. What he didn't know was this. By sundown, everyone in Pine Ridge would know that the giant cowboy had broken his silence, and that the orphan girl had called him her only friend. The fire crackled low, licking the blackened logs with a steady rhythm. Outside, the storm still muttered in the high branches, though the worst had passed. Pine Ridge lay buried under a thick coat of snow, the trail back down the mountain veiled in silence and ice. But inside Jonah Pike's cabin, the air was warm, thick with smoke and something unfamiliar uncertainty. Jonah stood by the hearth, hands on his hips, staring down at the little girl who had upended his world in a single night. Elsie lay on the bearskin rug, cocooned in a wool blanket, the color returning slowly to her cheeks. Her wooden doll rested in the crook of her arm, its paint worn smooth with years of love. She'd slept through the night without stirring, her breathing soft and steady. Jonah hadn't slept at all. He hadn't known what to do with her. He still didn't. But she was here, and she was hungry. Jonah turned to the narrow shelves above the stove. He wasn't much of a cook. Survival didn't require seasoning. He lived on jerky, hardtack, beans when he had them, and strong coffee boiled black enough to wake the dead. None of that seemed right for a child. He stared at a sack of flour as if expecting it to argue with him. Flatbread. That was something. He could manage that. He measured water into a bowl and stirred in handfuls of flour, adding a pinch of salt, kneading until his knuckles ached. He rolled the dough flat and slapped it onto a heated rock beside the fire. The smell of browning flour filled the cabin, familiar but somehow new. From the small crock buried behind the coffee tin, he pulled out a cloth-wrapped jar. Honey, rare and precious. He hadn't used it in over a year. Saving it, maybe. Though for what, he'd never said. Maybe this was what for. He spread the honey with the back of a spoon, watched it melt into the warm bread like gold, sinking into earth. Here, he said. Elsie stirred at the sound of his voice. Her eyes blinked open, heavy with sleep. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The moment her gaze landed on the food, her body tensed. She didn't reach for it. "It's yours," Jonah said. "Eat." "Are you sure?" she whispered. Jonah crouched beside her, pressing the warm bundle into her hands. "You don't ask for food unless you need it," he said. "You needed it." She stared at the bread like it might vanish. Then she bit into it. Her first bite was tentative, the second, hungry. By the third, tears welled in her eyes. Jonah turned away, giving her privacy she hadn't asked for, but clearly needed. When she was done, she wiped her hands on her skirt and looked up at him with something close to wonder. "That was the best thing I've ever tasted," she said. "Even better than Mama's gooseberry pie." And that was real good. Jonah didn't know how to answer that. He'd never been compared to gooseberry pie before. Instead, he asked, "What's your doll's name?" Elsie hugged the wooden figure close. "Her name's Clara. Papa carved her for me. She used to have a little red ribbon, but I lost it in the river last spring." Jonah nodded slowly. "You close with your father?" "I was," she said. Her voice didn't crack, but the silence that followed did. "He died in May. Mama, too. Fever." She didn't speak for a long moment, just ran her fingers along the doll's arms. "They buried them behind the old church. Then I went to live with Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret. They tried, but they didn't really want me." She looked up. "Not really." Jonah leaned back against the log wall. Words weren't his strong suit, not anymore. But he recognized the ache in her voice, the quiet acceptance. It was a sound he'd heard before, in the field hospitals, in the faces of widows standing alone beside fresh graves. "I don't talk much," he said. "Not like I used to." "That's okay," she said, soft. "I talk enough for both of us." A flicker of something stirred in Jonah's chest. It felt like warmth, or maybe pain. She stood carefully, legs shaky but determined. She wandered toward the window, bare toes curling on the wood plank floor. She didn't ask for permission, just moved like the cabin already belonged to her. "You live here all by yourself?" she asked. "I do. It's warm, like a fort. It's built to keep things out." She turned, hugging the blanket around her. "Now it keeps me in." Jonah stared at her. He had spent 15 years building walls, thick ones, around his cabin, around his heart, and in one snow-covered night, this child had walked right through all of them. The morning passed slowly. Jonah made coffee, strong and bitter. Elsie wrinkled her nose at the smell and requested hot water with honey instead. He didn't argue. He heated a kettle and poured it for her, watching her cradle the tin cup like it was treasure. The fire popped softly in the hearth. Sunlight filtered through the single window, slicing the room into gold and shadow. "I heard stories about you," Elsie said, sipping carefully. "The kids in town say you wrestled a bear." "That you once lived with wolves." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "Did they say whether I won?" She grinned. "Most of them think the bear ran." He allowed himself a quiet chuckle. "But you're not scary," she added. "Not really. Just quiet." Jonah's gaze drifted toward the fireplace. The stonework was tight, built to last, just like the rest of the cabin. Every joint and beam had a reason. No wasted space, no softness. And yet here she was, in bare feet, sipping honey water, filling the room with questions and breath. "You're braver than most," he said. "No," she replied, serious now. "I was just tired of waiting for someone to want me." Jonah didn't move, didn't speak, but the weight of her words fell like an anvil across his chest. That afternoon he carved a small wooden spoon. He didn't know why, just knew her hands were too small for the iron one she'd used that morning. He shaped it from juniper, the scent sweet and sharp in the cabin air. His fingers moved with purpose he hadn't felt in years. By the time he was done, Elsie was asleep again. Clara, the doll, was tucked beneath her chin. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders. Jonah rose quietly, covered her again, and placed the spoon on the table, just beside her cup. Outside, the sky began to change. Gray shadows shifted among the trees. A faint sound carried on the wind voices. Not the mountain's voice, human ones. Rough, concerned, boots crunching over snow. Jonah moved to the window. Riders 4, maybe 5, making their way up the trail, slow but certain. One figure in the lead short, broad-shouldered, riding a bay gelding with a limp. Thomas Brennan, the uncle. They'd come looking. Jonah stepped back from the window. His eyes drifted to the girl sleeping by his fire. Her cheeks flushed with safety, her breath steady. He felt something in his chest shift again. Not pain, not quite, but close. He reached for the rifle, leaning by the door, not to use but to carry. The storm might have passed, but another kind was on its way. The knock on the cabin door came just as Jonah set down his carving knife. It wasn't a loud knock, not demanding or urgent, just enough to let him know the world hadn't forgotten them. Elsie had already stirred at the sound of horses hours ago. She'd watched from the window as the riders appeared at the tree line. She hadn't said much since then. Jonah didn't know whether to be relieved or worried. He opened the door. Thomas Brennan stood at the edge of the porch, coat buttoned up tight, snow on his shoulders, and weariness etched into the corners of his face. Behind him stood Sheriff Matthews, Doc Harrison, and a thin woman with a scarf wrapped high around her cheeks. Margaret, most likely. "She here?" Thomas asked, eyes flicking past Jonah's broad frame into the warmth beyond. "She's safe," Jonah said. "She gave everyone a scare." "She's fine." For a moment, neither man moved. Then, from inside, Elsie appeared. She had her doll clutched to her chest, blanket still wrapped around her like a second skin. She didn't run to Thomas, didn't even call his name. She just stood beside Jonah like he was the doorframe she leaned on. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Thomas cleared his throat. "You shouldn't have run off, Elsie. You can't do that, especially not in weather like that." "I know." He tried again. "Your aunt's been worried sick." That wasn't true. Margaret hadn't looked sick with worry so much as annoyed when Jonah had spotted her riding up. "We'll talk more back at the house," Thomas said. Jonah waited. Elsie turned to look up at him. Her eyes were steady, clearer than they had any right to be after what she'd been through. "Goodbye, Mr. Jonah," she said. "Thank you for the warm food." He didn't know how to answer, so he didn't. He just nodded. She stepped down the stairs toward her uncle. At the bottom, she paused, then ran back, sudden and quiet, and wrapped her arms around Jonah's middle. It was so quick, so unexpected, he almost missed the feel of it. A child's hug, real, fierce. Then she was gone, riding back down the mountain behind her uncle, the others trailing behind. No one spoke. The storm had passed, but its echoes clung to the trees. Jonah watched them vanish into the woods. The snow crunched under hooves, then nothing. Just silence. He went back inside. The cabin felt colder than it had all winter. He added logs to the fire, even though it didn't need it. Swept the floor that was already clean, folded the blanket she'd used, then unfolded it again. Folded it tighter. The spoon he'd carved for her sat untouched on the table. He stared at it. Something in his chest ached like an old injury that never quite healed. Not pain, exactly, more like the absence of something warm. 15 years ago, he'd sworn off caring. Caring meant loss. Caring meant graves. But Elsie hadn't asked him to care. She'd just come in from the snow, looked at him like he mattered, and called him kind without ever using the word. And now she was gone. He sat in his chair long after the fire burned low, watching shadows stretch across the floorboards. She'd been here barely a day, yet the silence left behind felt sharper than any knife. Outside, a hawk screamed from the ridge. Inside, Jonah Pike didn't move. 2 days passed. The snow melted off the porch. Jonah chopped wood, checked his traps, hauled water. He told himself nothing had changed. He was lying. He went into town on the 3rd morning, same as always. Tied his mare to the post outside Morrison's general store, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The usual heads turned. Mrs. Caldwell narrowed her eyes. Old Jim Watson looked down quick. Nobody said a word. He walked to the counter. Morrison's boy was stacking tins of beans. Jonah dropped 2 fox pelts and a bundle of rabbit fur beside the scale. Flour, he said. Salt. Coffee. As Morrison weighed the pelts, a small hand tugged at Jonah's coat. He turned. Elsie stood there, eyes bright, cheeks pink from the cold. She didn't say anything, just pressed something folded into his calloused hand. Then she walked away, slipping back to where her uncle was talking with the store clerk. Jonah looked down at the paper in his palm, unfolded it. A child's drawing, made with charcoal and a heavy hand. Shaky lines formed a log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. 2 stick figures stood on the porch, one tall, one small. He knew who they were. He stared at it longer than he meant to. When he finally looked up, Elsie was gone, but the drawing stayed in his pocket all the way back up the mountain. The first morning she came back, Jonah thought he was hearing things. It was the sound of boots on the frosted trail light, too light to be a man's, and then the soft rustle of pine needles brushing against a dress hem. He was halfway through splitting logs out back when the footsteps stopped just beyond the tree line. Then her voice called out, quiet but clear. "I brought marigolds." Jonah turned, axe still in hand. Elsie stood just beyond the chopping block, cheeks flushed with cold, a fistful of crooked orange flowers clutched in one hand, and that same stubborn hope in her eyes. She wore a wool shawl wrapped tight, boots slightly too big, and a patched-up bonnet pushed back on her head. He hadn't expected to see her again. Not like this. "I told Uncle Thomas I wanted to bring you something," she said. He didn't say no. Jonah said nothing. She stepped closer, hesitated, then offered the flowers. Marigolds in late winter, likely stolen from the Widow Prentice's window boxes. Still, she held them like an offering. He didn't reach for them. Instead, he nodded toward the porch. "Come in." She beamed and climbed the steps like she belonged there, and from that day on she came every morning. Sometimes with a flower, sometimes with nothing but a story and a grin. She'd climb the trail alone, wave to him from the ridge, and sit beside the fire like it was her chair waiting. He didn't ask questions, didn't send her away. Something about her presence filled the spaces in his cabin that he hadn't noticed were empty. She moved like she'd memorized the layout, fetched her own cup from the shelf, arranged her doll on the mantel just so, and always started talking about the way the hens squawked when Aunt Margaret tried to collect eggs, about a boy named Sawyer who called her Carrot Head and got smacked with her lunch tin, about the clouds shaped like buffalo. Sometimes, in the pauses between her rambling, she'd ask questions. Did you really fight in the war? Yes. Did you shoot anyone? He'd look at her then, quiet, steady. Yes. Did it make you sad? Yes. She never asked twice. Jonah found himself watching for her shadow in the trees before he even realized he was hoping for it. When she arrived on the 5th day, she held up a muddy book. I found Ma's old nature guide, she said. Can you teach me about tracks? Jonah looked down at the book, its pages water-warped and cracked at the edges. Suppose I could. They spent that morning on their knees in the clearing behind the cabin. He showed her the difference between rabbit prints and fox, how to spot where a deer had bedded down for the night. She followed him through the underbrush like a cub, wide-eyed, full of questions. Why are the back feet ahead of the front? Because rabbits bound. Why is the mud darker here? Because something bled. She looked up at that, startled. Coyotes took a fawn last night, he said. Elsie nodded solemnly. That's nature, right? He didn't answer, just looked out at the trees and thought, that's loss. By the end of the week, she could spot squirrel scratches on bark, tell which direction the wind had blown by the way snow gathered on pine needles, and make a decent fire with only birch bark and flint. He watched her learn with the kind of quiet pride that surprised him. Not loud, not showy, just full. That night, after she'd gone back to town with the promise of returning the next morning, Jonah sat by the hearth, a block of maple wood in his lap. The girl needed a spoon. She'd been using his metal one all week, and he'd seen her wince each time it burned her lips. So he carved. The knife moved slow and steady through the grain, his hands remembering shapes they hadn't made since his daughter's cradle. He worked by firelight, smoothing the curve, hollowing the bowl, rounding the handle. It took hours. When he finished, he held it up to the light. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. The next morning, she arrived with a handful of wild onion and a feather in her hair. Jonah was waiting on the porch. Without a word, he held out the spoon. She took it, cradled it like something breakable. You made this? He nodded. For me? Another nod. She looked at it, ran her fingers along the grain. Then she looked at him, not with the awe kids usually gave him, not with fear or curiosity, with something else. Trust. This is the nicest thing anyone's ever given me, she said. And before he could stop her, she hugged him again, arms around his waist, head pressed against his vest. He froze, didn't know what to do with his hands, but something inside him cracked. Not pain, not grief, just warmth, old and deep, surfacing through years of cold. He wanted to tell her something about how he used to carve cradles, about how his hands weren't made for gentleness anymore, about how this spoon had taken something out of him he didn't know he still had. But he didn't say any of it. He just said, "Breakfast's ready." And as they stepped inside, neither of them saw the shadow watching from the ridge above the glint of a spyglass catching morning light. Nor did they hear the soft scuff of boots turning back down the mountain. A man with a reason, a plan, and a secret. One who hadn't forgotten what Jonah Pike had done during the war. One who had questions about why a girl like Elsie Brennan spent every day alone with the giant no one dared talk to. Autumn settled on Eagle's Beak like a soft quilt, gold and copper spilling down the mountainsides. Each morning the air grew crisper, and frost laced the meadow grass around Jonah's cabin. The change in season brought new rhythms, stacking wood higher against the north wall, mending traps before the first snows, stirring stew that smelled of venison and sage. But one rhythm never wavered: small boots on the trail, a light knock on the heavy door. That morning, Elsie arrived with her bonnet askew and her cheeks pink from the climb. She carried something under her arm wrapped in faded calico. Without a word, she walked past Jonah, settled on her usual spot near the fire, and began untying the cloth. "I made you something," she said, her voice shy but proud. Jonah sat on his chair opposite her, rough hands resting on his knees. "What's this?" She unfolded the bundle to reveal a small book, no bigger than her two hands, its cover made of cardboard and tied together with string. Inside, sheets of old school paper had been glued 2 by 2, and on each page lay a pressed wildflower: purple lupine, yellow cinquefoil, Indian paintbrush in rusty orange, even a few late-blooming daisies, their white petals still clinging to their centers. "It's all the flowers from the trail up here," Elsie explained. "Miss Sarah at school taught me how to press them so they'll keep. I thought maybe you'd like to see what I see when I walk to your cabin." Jonah turned the pages slowly, his scarred fingers dwarfing the fragile paper. He had no words for the ache rising in his chest. No one had given him a gift in years, not since Sarah. He cleared his throat. "It's fine work," he managed. Elsie smiled at that, understanding more in his tone than the words themselves. "I'll keep adding to it." Every time I find a new one, they sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, a hawk cried over the valley. Jonah closed the book and set it gently on the table, as if it might crumble in his hands. When he looked back at her, she was watching him with that same quiet curiosity. "Why don't you ever come to town?" she asked suddenly. He wasn't expecting it. "What? You never come for church or the fair or anything? People in town say you used to be different." "You used to smile." Her voice softened. "Was it because of the war?" Jonah stared into the fire for a long moment. His first instinct was to shut her out, as he had everyone else. But the pressed flowers on the table spoke louder than his fear. "My wife's name was Sarah," he said at last. His voice was rough but steady. "We built a cabin down by Willow Creek. She was expecting our first child when I left to fight. A little girl." Elsie's eyes widened. "What happened to them?" "Scarlet fever," he said simply, "while I was still at war. By the time I came home, there were 2 graves and no one to meet me. I sold the cabin and came up here." Elsie didn't speak right away. She reached across the space between them and laid her small hand over his scarred knuckles. "My mama liked flowers," she whispered. "She said they were God's way of telling us he still wanted things to grow." Jonah's throat tightened. "Sounds like something Sarah would have said." "I want you to teach me to plant them," Elsie said. Her voice trembled a little, but her eyes were steady. "Not just press them. I want to grow them like Mama did." Jonah looked at her, this small girl with her book of memories and her creek water eyes. He'd avoided gardens for 15 years because gardens meant roots, and roots meant staying. But looking at her now, he felt something shift. "Come spring," he said quietly, "we'll plant together." Elsie grinned, and for a moment the cabin felt like a home instead of a fortress. She stayed until the sun dipped low behind the peaks, telling him stories about school, about how Miss Sarah had tripped over a cat and spilled ink on her dress, about how the church bell sounded different on frosty mornings. Jonah listened, feeling the warmth of her voice seep into places he'd kept cold for so long. When she left, he stood on the porch watching her small figure wind down the trail, her bonnet bobbing against the gold and crimson backdrop. He didn't see the man at the edge of the trees farther down the slope, standing still as a post, notebook in hand. Thomas Brennan had been waiting there for nearly an hour, watching through field glasses borrowed from Sheriff Matthews. His breath fogged in the evening air as he scribbled notes. The time of Elsie's arrival, the length of her stay, the fact that she left carrying nothing but her doll and a smile. He closed the book slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back toward town, boots crunching on the frosty ground. The letter arrived without a signature. Sheriff Matthews unfolded the parchment on his desk slowly, his jaw tightening with every word. Accusations veiled in civility, concern dressed up as decency, phrases like inappropriate influence, unsupervised contact with a minor, and psychological danger. It was printed in tidy handwriting, not crude like the usual complaint letters. He read it twice. Then he took off his hat and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window toward the ridge where Jonah Pike's cabin sat like a stubborn stone. He didn't want to believe it, but the law didn't ask what he wanted. A week later, the marshal came riding in under gray clouds. He wasn't from Pine Ridge. That much was clear from the polished boots, the iron badge too clean to belong to any local man, and the way he looked at people like he already knew where the guilt lay. Marshal Colby Harlan, out of Gunnison, sent at the request of Denver authorities. He stepped off his horse in front of the sheriff's office, took one look at the general store, the boarding house, and the row of silent folks standing out front, then said, "Let's get this over with." Elsie was pulled from her class at the little schoolhouse. Miss Sarah frowned but didn't argue when the sheriff and the marshal came to collect her. She followed them without a fuss, her doll clutched tight in one hand. In the back of the sheriff's office, she sat straight in the chair, boots swinging above the floorboards, while Colby Harlan asked his questions in that slow, polite tone that made Matthews grind his teeth. "How long have you been visiting Mr. Pike?" Elsie blinked. "Since the snow. After I got lost, he helped me, and has he ever touched you? In any way that made you uncomfortable?" Her brow furrowed. "No. He made me soup. Did he ever tell you to keep secrets from your uncle?" "No." "Did he ever talk about your parents?" "No, sir." "What does he talk about?" "Bird calls, trees, how to whittle." She looked at the sheriff then, worried. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Matthews said gently. "You're not." Colby didn't write anything. He just stared at her with eyes like river stones, smooth and cold. Next came Doc Harrison, then Miss Sarah, then the widow Prentice, who had never spoken to Jonah but once saw him help a dog that had been hit by a wagon and thought maybe he had some kindness in him. Then Thomas Brennan was called. He arrived clean-shaven, pressed coat, sorrow in his voice. "I've tried to raise Elsie right," he said. "I just don't think an old soldier like Jonah Pike is the right kind of company for a girl her age. He's damaged. There's talk." "What talk?" Matthews asked, dry. Thomas shrugged. "Whispers. Concerns. You know how folks get. Half the town did get that way. The pew warmers, the widow circle, the shopkeepers who looked down their noses but never missed a Sunday. They shook their heads in the street and muttered about decency, about boundaries, about little girls and lonely men. The other half stayed quiet, until the night after the hearing when Jonah walked into the general store. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. No slamming doors, no glowering eyes. He just came in like always, collected a sack of beans and placed 2 pelts on the counter. But the room went still. Morrison didn't say a word. 2 women stopped whispering near the pickle barrel. Even old Jim Watson, who'd always greeted Jonah with a nod, stared at the floor. Jonah turned slowly, eyes scanning faces that now wouldn't meet his. He left without the beans. Back at the cabin, he didn't say a word, just fed the fire, sharpened his knife, and sat in silence while the shadows grew long on the floorboards. The next day, Elsie didn't come. The day after, still no sign of her. Jonah chopped wood until his hands blistered. He rebuilt a trap line no animal had touched in weeks. He cleaned the stovepipe, replaced the thatch on the shed roof. Still, she didn't come. He found her drawing tucked between the pressed flower book, a picture of the two of them planting something side by side. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it back between the pages. That night, a knock came at the door. It wasn't her. Sheriff Matthews stood on the porch, hat in hand, eyes downcast. "Jonah," he said, voice low. "You've been summoned." Jonah didn't need to ask why. The weight in the sheriff's voice told him everything. "A formal hearing," Matthews continued. "Town Hall, 3 days from now. They want answers." Jonah looked past him toward the fire-lit windows. He hadn't lit the lamp yet. He didn't want to see the inside too clearly, not when it felt like it was emptying by the day. "I've done nothing wrong," he said flatly. "I know that," Matthews replied, "but this isn't about the law anymore. It's about what people think." Jonah nodded once. Before he left, he stood at the door and looked back at the room. The spoon still on the table, the fire still burning, her little cup on the shelf untouched. "I lost a daughter once," he whispered. Then he stepped out into the cold, eyes turned toward the dark ridge below. "I may lose her too." The town hall had never been so full. The benches overflowed with neighbors and townsfolk, men still wearing their work aprons, women clutching shawls and prayer books. Even the children had gathered at the windows, noses pressed to the glass, trying to catch a glimpse of what would unfold inside. Up front, the long pine desk served as the judge's bench, though Judge Harper himself was away down in Denver. In his absence, Marshal Colby Harlan stood tall behind the table, coat buttoned to the throat, silver star gleaming like cold judgment. He looked out over the crowd without a flicker of warmth. Sheriff Matthews stood beside him, arms folded across his chest, expression unreadable. Jonah Pike sat alone, his wide shoulders hunched just slightly forward, hat resting on his knee, jaw tight. He didn't fidget, didn't speak, didn't even blink much. The town had never seen him look smaller, and never more like a man carved from stone. The whispers began as soon as he entered. Martha Brody leaned into her husband. "They say he carved the girl a spoon." "That's no crime," her husband muttered. "Well, maybe not, but—" A single tap of the gavel silenced them. "Marshal Harlan," Sheriff Matthews said, clearing his throat, "you've called this hearing." "Let's get to it." Harlan wasted no time. "We've received formal complaints regarding Mr. Jonah Pike and his unsupervised contact with a minor, namely Miss Elsie Brennan. The accusations range from inappropriate influence to potential endangerment. Today we hear from the girl herself and the community before a ruling is issued on guardianship and future contact." His eyes scanned the room, then landed on the small figure seated off to the side, next to Margaret Brennan. Elsie. Her legs swung nervously beneath her chair, boots barely brushing the floor. She clutched her pressed flower journal to her chest like it might anchor her. Harlan addressed her directly. "Miss Brennan, would you come forward, please?" Margaret stiffened, but Thomas gave a small nod. Something in him had shifted lately, his mouth drawn tighter but his gaze less cold. He didn't meet Jonah's eyes. Elsie stood, walked to the center of the room. She looked so small against the backdrop of pine walls and watchful eyes. "Miss Brennan," Harlan said, voice firm, "do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, sir." "And you understand that you must tell the truth?" "I always try to." A few murmurs stirred behind her. "Tell the court, how did your friendship with Mr. Pike begin?" Elsie's voice was soft but steady. "I got lost in a snowstorm. I was cold and scared, and I knocked on his door. He helped me. Did he ever touch you in a way that made you uncomfortable?" "No, sir." "Did he ever tell you to keep secrets?" "No, sir." Then why do you go to his cabin every day? Why not stay with your family? Elsie looked down for a long moment. Then she looked up, her voice stronger. Because he listens. There was a stillness in the room. When I talk to other people, she said, they nod and smile, but they don't hear. Jonah hears me. He taught me bird calls. He made me a spoon when mine broke. He made a fire when my hands were too cold to feel. He let me plant seeds. He makes me feel like I matter. No one spoke. Harlan hesitated. Do you consider Mr. Pike to be your guardian? I think, she swallowed. I think he's the first person who's made me feel safe since my mama died. She stepped back, returned to her seat beside Margaret. Even Margaret looked shaken, her mouth thin, but her hand rested gently on the child's shoulder for once. Then came the testimonies. Doc Harrison spoke first. I've treated Jonah Pike since the war. Never once seen him raise his voice, let alone a hand. He's broken, yes, but he's not dangerous. Miss Sarah followed. Elsie's a brighter student since she's been around him. She reads more. She smiles more. Even old Jim Watson surprised the crowd when he stood. That man dragged my mule out of a ditch in '72 and never said a word. We don't have enough men like him anymore. Thomas Brennan was last. He walked to the front slowly, cleared his throat, glanced toward Jonah, then Elsie. When my brother and his wife died, he said, I was handed a child I didn't ask for. I've tried to do my duty, but somewhere along the line, Jonah Pike stepped in where I failed. A few gasps rose. I thought I was jealous, Thomas continued, jealous that a man like him with his past could become the person she trusted most. But watching her up here, I realize, maybe I should be grateful. He looked directly at the marshal. He never stole her from me. He gave her back hope. Harlan leaned back. The room was holding its breath. He rose slowly, pulled a folded paper from his coat, and read in a neutral tone. Given the testimonies presented, the absence of any proven misconduct, and the emotional bond demonstrated between Mr. Pike and Miss Brennan, this court grants temporary guardianship of Miss Elsie Brennan to Mr. Jonah Pike. A wave of murmurs broke over the room. Under strict oversight, Harlan added, voice sharp. All visits and overnight stays must be documented. The sheriff's office will conduct monthly welfare checks, and any breach of trust will result in immediate revocation. Jonah said nothing, but when Elsie turned around in her chair and smiled at him, really smiled, something broke open inside his chest. Not grief, not pain, just something warm, rare, and terribly fragile. As the hall emptied, Matthews approached him quietly. You'll need to sign some papers. Marshal's orders, Jonah nodded, but his eyes were still on the child weaving her way back toward him. In his pocket, folded carefully, the flower book pressed against his side like a heartbeat. By the time the first crocus bloomed through the patchy snow, Jonah Pike had become a fixture in town again, not as the giant recluse folks used to whisper about, but as the man who brought Elsie Brennan back to life. It didn't happen overnight. There were still glances, of course, still quiet questions exchanged between shopkeepers and churchwomen, still fingers pointing from porch railings when Jonah rode into town with Elsie riding pillion behind him. But something had shifted. The tide had turned, not because Jonah tried to win them over, but because people couldn't deny what they were seeing. Elsie had changed. She smiled more, read faster, held her head higher when answering questions in class. Miss Sarah said she was drawing again real pictures now, full of wildflowers, birds, and tall cabins tucked beneath even taller mountains. At the clinic, Doc Harrison said she hadn't had a single spell of coughing all spring. Strong as a colt now, he muttered while scribbling into his logbook. Whatever that man's doing up there, it's better than any medicine I've got. Even the sheriff's monthly welfare checks, once stiff and formal, began to feel more like visits. Matthews would ride up the ridge, tip his hat, accept a cup of coffee, and spend a few quiet minutes watching Jonah and Elsie mend fences, tend seedlings, or stack kindling. "She's growing," Matthews said once, resting his hands on his belt. "Not just taller." "You know what I mean," Jonah nodded. He did. That spring, the garden came alive. Jonah and Elsie spent their afternoons digging rows beside the cabin neat furrows for carrots, beans, and beets. On one edge, they planted sunflowers, and in the corner near the stone path, Elsie helped tuck daisy seeds into the soil. Jonah built her a trellis out of old wagon wheels and birch branches, and Elsie tied the first vines with little ribbons from her mother's sewing box. Each morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, Jonah would find her crouched beside the sprouts, humming nonsense songs, whispering encouragement like the flowers were friends who just needed a little extra warmth to bloom. "You think they can hear you?" he asked one day, leaning on his spade. Elsie grinned up at him. "I know they can." Jonah smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. It was a quiet life, but a full one. A life built not on grand gestures or public praise, but on 100 small acts, brushing her braid before school, carving her a new picture frame, tucking a note into her satchel when she had a spelling test. The town noticed. When the school board reviewed guardianship, Miss Sarah submitted a written recommendation. Doc Harrison vouched for Elsie's health. Sheriff Matthews delivered a signed affidavit stating the cabin was clean, stable, and safe. Even Margaret, though stiff and reluctant, admitted Elsie was happier than she's ever been. Thomas didn't speak at all, but he came to the hearing, sat in the back, listened without interrupting. When it was over, he left quietly, but not before tipping his hat to Jonah as they passed in the aisle. A few weeks later, Jonah stood before the county clerk and signed his name in careful block letters beside the line marked Guardian of Record. He stared at the page for a moment after, ink still wet, then stepped back and let the clerk seal it with the county stamp. Outside, Elsie waited on the porch, kicking at the dust with her boots. "Well?" she asked. "It's official," he said. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Just looked down, toed the wood. "Can I ask you something?" she finally whispered. "Of course." She looked up at him with those pale blue eyes. "Can I call you Papa now?" Jonah felt the question land like a stone thrown into still water. He'd known it was coming, had heard the word flutter at the edges of her sentences for weeks, half-formed, half-swallowed. He thought he'd be ready when it came, but he wasn't. He bent to one knee, took her hand in his rough one. "You always could," he said. She didn't cry, neither did he. But for a long time they stood there in the doorway of the clerk's office as the town moved slowly around them, and the sound of the world softened just enough to let the moment settle between them like sunlight in the cracks of old wood. That evening, back at the cabin, they planted 2 more rows in the garden. One for cucumbers, one for zinnias. Elsie pressed her palms into the dirt, giggling at how cold it still felt, even after the warm day. Jonah stood nearby, watering the newly sprouted daisies. He glanced toward the tree line, the last of the light painting gold across the mountains. He didn't know what would come next, what trials still waited, what hearts might still need winning. But for the first time in years, he felt like a man not surviving the wilderness, but building something in it, something growing, something worth staying for. By midsummer, the wind in Pine Ridge no longer carried only the scent of pine and dust. It brought something sweeter, now warm bread, lavender from Miss Hannah's window boxes, the sharp tang of wood smoke curling from chimneys even on cool mornings. And when it passed over Jonah Pike's cabin on the ridge, it carried laughter. Real, unguarded laughter. The kind that made even the trees seem to lean in closer. The old man, once known as a ghost among them, was now just a neighbor. A quiet one, sure, but a familiar one. The kind who helped re-roof the schoolhouse without being asked, who always had an extra blanket ready when someone's stove broke, and who took time at the general store to let little kids pat the muzzle of his horse. He wasn't talkative. That hadn't changed, but folks didn't need words as much as they thought. At least, not when the coffee was hot and the silence was kind. The cabin had changed, too. What was once a fortress tucked away in the trees now breathed like a real home. The shutters were freshly painted, white with little green accents. Elsie's idea, a wind chime made from old tin spoons, clinked near the door. Inside, the scent of cinnamon clung to the walls, baked into the very wood grain. Some nights, neighbors stopped by just to sit on the porch. They didn't always say much. But they came, and they stayed, and when the stars rose over the ridge, someone always said, "Feels warmer up here." In early August, Sheriff Matthews brought Jonah a box of law books. "Elsie's been asking about court stuff," he said with a grin. "Figured you two might want to read up together." Jonah nodded and took the books without a word. A week later, he returned them with a paper tucked inside. Elsie's handwriting, neat and careful. "Thank you, Sheriff. We're going to build our own courtroom for the squirrels." Even Thomas Brennan began to change. At first, his visits were awkward, tense affairs, full of clipped sentences and long pauses. But he came anyway. He found work at the freight station on the edge of town, loading grain and driving supply wagons. The work suited him, gave him sweat and purpose. One evening he arrived at the cabin with a small wooden box in hand, inside a locket belonging to Elsie's mother. He hadn't wanted to part with it before. "I figured it should go to her now," he said. Jonah watched him, quiet as ever. Thomas cleared his throat. "I didn't treat you right. I see that now." "You treated yourself worse," Jonah replied. Thomas blinked, then gave a slow nod. "Maybe so." The two men stood a few paces apart, the summer air thick with truce. Inside, Elsie ran her fingers over the locket. She didn't open it yet. She just pressed it to her chest and sat very still. That night, she helped Jonah hang a new picture frame on the wall, one carved with wildflowers and small birds, the frame that held the last photograph of her parents. Below it, they placed a small table. On it, a cup of fresh water. And in the morning, she left a single white daisy there. Jonah noticed, but said nothing. He watched from the porch as she knelt quietly, hands folded, the morning light curling around her like a shawl. When she came back inside, she didn't say much either. But she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek before going to wash up. Later, while turning soil in the garden, she looked over her shoulder. "Do you think Mama can see the flowers?" Jonah rested on his shovel. "I think she sees everything that matters." Elsie nodded. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny cloth sachet sewn with awkward stitches, stuffed with petals from the garden, tied with a frayed bit of ribbon. "For you," she said. "It's got lavender and lemon balm and a little dirt from the path." He took it carefully, held it to his nose. "Smells like home." That night he placed it on his nightstand beside the spoon, the flower journal, and the carved bird whistle she'd made him from a hollowed twig. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of baking bread and sun-warmed earth. And the next morning, long before the sun broke over the ridge, Jonah found her already awake, kneeling beside the photo of her mother, placing another white daisy gently beneath the glass. The first morning of spring came soft and golden, the kind of morning that made the earth feel new again. Sunlight filtered through the bare trees, kissing the frost that still clung to fence posts, while birds stitched song into the air. The wind had lost its bite, and in its place came the gentle promise of growing things. Jonah Pike stood outside the cabin with a small cloth sack in his hand, heavy with seed. His boots pressed down into soft, tilled earth. Beside him, Elsie crouched low, her blue dress tucked up under her knees, hands already dark with dirt. She dug with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to place new life. "This one's for the daisies," she said, pressing her thumb into the soil. Jonah nodded. "And that patch by the fence?" "Sunflowers. Tall as you," he chuckled, the sound deep and rare. "That'd be a sight." For a while they worked in silence, not the kind born of discomfort, but one that settled easy between them. The silence of two people who had weathered storms and knew how to listen to the soil, to the wind, to each other. Later, inside the cabin, the warmth of the stove touched every corner. The scent of cinnamon biscuits drifted through the air, mingling with pine sap and damp earth. On the windowsill, a pot of early crocuses leaned into the morning light. Jonah washed his hands at the basin. The lines in his palms were deeper now, but steadier. He no longer moved like a man waiting for something to fall apart. Elsie poured tea into 2 tin cups and added an extra spoonful of honey to his without asking. "I think we should build a bench by the fence," she said. "That way people can sit when they visit." "People visit now," he teased. She grinned. "They will." "Miss Sarah says she wants to see the garden. Doc Harrison said he might bring pickles." And they did. Later that afternoon, neighbors trickled in like light through a canopy. Sheriff Matthews brought dried apples. Miss Sarah arrived with a stack of books for Elsie. Even Martha Brody, who used to cross the street to avoid Jonah, showed up with a tin of lemon bars and left with a smile. No one made speeches. No one called it anything. But it felt like something holy. A town learning to stretch itself wider. Jonah's cabin had been a fortress for 15 years. Now, with its windows open and chairs pulled out, it had become a home, not just for him, but for anyone who needed a place to land. As the sun dipped low, casting the sky in molten orange, Jonah stepped into the bedroom and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a pocket watch, scratched, old, and silent. He turned it over in his hand. The chain was worn, the hinge a little stiff. He pressed the small button at the top, and the cover flipped open with a soft click. Inside, the hour hand sat frozen at 2:17, the minute the telegram had arrived all those years ago, telling him about the fire, the loss, the end of a world. For 15 years, the watch had stayed quiet. Jonah lifted it gently, cranked the stem, and wound the spring. Tick, 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 a sound like breath returning. He stared at it for a long while, then slipped it into the pocket of his vest. When he stepped back outside, Elsie looked up from her notebook. "What you doing?" she asked. He smiled, subtle and steady. "Time's moving again." She reached for his hand, and together they walked out into the yard, where the wind danced through the garden rows and the first brave buds began pushing toward the sky. Behind them, the cabin glowed warm with lamplight. Ahead, the hills whispered promises of spring, and somewhere in the distance, the story of the giant cowboy and the orphan girl was only just beginning. If this tale stirred something in you, if it reminded you that broken people can build beautiful things, then saddle up and stay with us. Because the West still has more stories to tell. Subscribe now to Western Legacy, and don't miss the next chapter of quiet courage, deep roots, and the healing power of love beneath wide-open skies.